Let's turn to what Mr. Albrecht said during his presentation. He began with a definition which was unobjectionable. I think he took the definition from Ott. He could have taken it almost the same words from the council itself. He suggested there's some proof from Scripture, but when you examine his proof, he talks about the continuity of the church, but the continuity of the church doesn't imply papal infallibility as some sort of logical consequence. It might be nice to have, but you can have continuity of a church without having papal infallibility. The Jews had continuity without papal infallibility. He said that the keys that are given to Peter somehow relate to doctrine, and somehow they relate to binding and loosing. Presumably, he's trying to suggest that they relate to binding and loosing doctrines, although I don't recall him specifically making that argument. And if they just relate to church discipline, to binding and loosing sins, which seems to be the primary sense that's given to this by official Roman sources when they're talking about indulgences, for example, they use this verse to justify the use of indulgences to release people from purgatory. That sounds like binding and loosing in disciplinary situations. And also, Rome doesn't claim to be infallible in disciplinary issues. They don't claim that the excommunication or attempted excommunication of Galileo was infallible. They just assert that it's a disciplinary practice. And so it seems as though you can't get papal infallibility from Matthew 16, even if it related to doctrine, since according to Rome it also relates to discipline, and it's not infallible when it relates to discipline. In John 21:15, there's an allegation that this is talking about Peter being a universal shepherd. Well, let's say perhaps it did. But even if it did, it doesn't say anything about Peter's successors, and it doesn't say he has to have infallibility to be their universal leader. There's no necessary implication that in order to have a universal leader, you would need to have that leader have infallibility. And of course, there's no scriptural proof that he was the universal leader. There's some allegation we'll get to in a second about what the fathers. But let's continue on. He says he also appealed to Luke 22, suggesting that this confirmation of the faith that was given to Peter must also be given to successors. But the question really is why? Why can't the other disciples, having had their faith confirmed, pass on this confirmation of faith in a network array, spreading out from the disciples who were strengthened by Peter to those of their disciples who were strengthened by them, to all of the Christians throughout the world who are strengthened in their afflictions by those who have come before them. There's no need for this to be specifically about a Roman bishop, and because it doesn't have to do with binding doctrine. It doesn't have to do with anything specific to leadership in terms of leading the church doctrinally, in terms of defining dogma. Turning to what Mr. Albrecht had to say about the fathers, he, as I mentioned before, acknowledges that they mostly speak of it, which I think is a nice way of saying they don't speak of it at all. He quotes Ignatius, who says he doesn't teach the Roman Church, but he forgot to mention that Ignatius doesn't mention a Roman bishop. He doesn't mention a singular bishop at Rome. It would be kind of hard for Ignatius to believe in papal infallibility if he doesn't believe in a pope. He doesn't know the bishop, or he doesn't mention the name of the bishop of Rome, whereas he mentions the name of a bishop in lots of other cities to which he writes. Irenaeus, he says, explains that there's a special preeminence to the Roman Church. But what he doesn't notice is that he speaks of it as the Roman Church, not as the universal church, not the Catholic Church. He says the Roman Church, and he talks about lots of different churches. Again, this is hardly an example of a Roman Catholic ecclesiology. It doesn't talk about a Roman system at all. There's some mention here about the chair of Peter from Cyprian. We could get into that if we need to in more detail, but perhaps it's sufficient to point out that Cyprian resisted the Pope, if you want to call him the Pope, the Bishop of Rome in his day. Jerome says, with you alone in one of his letters, but of course Jerome is just flattering the Roman bishop to whom he's writing. It's his home church where he came from, and of course he communicates with them when he's in a strange country surrounded by all kinds of nonsense that's going on. There's a quotation, something that made it sound as though causa finita est is from Augustine. I hope Mr. Albrecht's aware that that is a gloss on Augustine. It's not what he actually said. Moving on, Mr. Albrecht referred us back again to Matthew 16:19. And he says that we need to have this fairly clearly established, or we need to be clear about this verse. But the binding and loosing there doesn't seem to refer to doctrines. What does it refer to? Well, according to some places that we see in Rome's literature, it refers to binding and loosing in disciplinary terms, binding and loosing sins. What about John 21:15? Well, the question here is, what about successors? There's no mention here about successors, even though he claims that 20 church fathers talk about this as referring to Peter. I wonder how many of those 20, Mr. Albrecht can tell us, referred this to successors of Peter. Was this really to Peter alone and only to Peter? In which case, of course, we're not at Vatican I's doctrine. And finally, Mr. Albrecht referred to Luke 22:32, which I've already discussed at length, so I won't burden you with more discussion there. Mr. Albrecht concluded on an interesting note, and one that ties very nicely into what Vatican I said. He says, why was Vatican I right? Because God keeps his promises. And indeed, Vatican I asserts that there's a promise there. But my question for Mr. Albrecht is, where is this promise? There's a promise that he's going to strengthen Peter's faith and get him through temptation. But where is this promise that he's going to have infallibility? It's nowhere to be found. It's not to be found in the scriptures. It's not to be found in the fathers. And so I must respectfully but firmly insist that Vatican I was wrong in its definition of papal infallibility.